Right now, you are probably taking a sip of something. Maybe it's a coffee, maybe a soda, or maybe you're having a drink. A beer, a glass of wine, a cocktail. And the last time you had a drink, you probably just drank it, enjoyed the buzz, and completely forgot about it. But what you did in that moment is one of the oldest, most fundamental things a human being can do. It is older than writing, it is older than farming, it is older than the wheel, mathematics, or the concept of money. In fact, it actually predates human beings entirely. Because our complex, messy, and deeply ingrained relationship with alcohol does not start a few thousand years ago with the invention of wine in a Mediterranean vineyard, or the first rudimentary brewery in Mesopotamia. It starts about 10 million years ago, on a damp forest floor in Africa, with a small primate picking up a piece of fruit that had simply been sitting on the ground for a little too long. In 2014, a biologist at UC Berkeley named Robert Dudley published a fascinating book called The Drunken Monkey. His argument was incredibly simple, yet it completely rewrote how we understand our craving for alcohol. When a piece of fruit becomes overripe, falls from the canopy, and hits the warm, humid forest floor, the natural sugars inside it begin to break down. Yeast from the environment gets in, a natural process of fermentation begins, and that sweet fruit starts producing small amounts of ethanol. Now, most animals cannot process ethanol efficiently. If they eat fermented fruit, they get sick, or they get dangerously uncoordinated, which in the wild means you become someone else's lunch. But around 10 million years ago, a genetic mutation occurred in our primate ancestors. A specific enzyme called ADH4 mutated, making it suddenly 40 times more efficient at breaking down ethanol. This was not a mistake, it was an evolutionary superpower. It meant that while other primates had to compete fiercely for fresh fruit high up in the trees, our ancestors could safely scavenge the fermented, calorie-dense, overripe fruit that had fallen to the ground. And when they ate that fruit, the tiny amounts of ethanol inside it made them feel just a little bit buzzed. They had absolutely no idea why, but the dopamine hit felt good. It signaled a rich source of calories, which meant survival. So, they kept coming back for more. Over millions of years, our ancestors didn't just passively tolerate alcohol. They actively evolved to seek it out by scent. The smell of fermentation meant food. So, by the time Homo sapiens actually walked the earth, the biological hardware to process alcohol, and the psychological desire to consume it were already hardwired into our brains. The taste for it was built in long before anyone, anywhere, ever figured out how to make it on purpose. So the ultimate question is, when exactly did we figure that out? When did we stop scavenging for drunken fruit and start acting as the brewmasters of our own destiny? To answer that, we have to travel to a cave near Haifa, Israel. The year is 2018, and a team of archaeologists are painstakingly excavating a site known as Raqefet Cave. This cave was used as a burial site by an ancient, semi-nomadic group of people known as the Natufians, roughly 13,000 years ago. As researchers brushed away the dust of millennia, they found stone mortars carved directly into the solid bedrock of the cave floor. Now, finding stone tools isn't exactly front-page news. But when scientists carefully scraped the insides of these mortars and analyzed the microscopic residue left behind, they found something that shook the archaeological world. They found phytoliths and starch granules from wheat and barley. But these weren't just raw grains. The chemical signatures proved that these grains had been deliberately soaked in water, allowed to germinate, mashed, and then left to ferment. 13,000 years ago, in a cave in the Middle East, someone was brewing beer. Now, you might be thinking, okay, ancient people made beer. What's the big deal? Here is what makes that specific finding in Raqefet Cave so earth-shattering. The Natufians were not farmers. They hadn't invented agriculture yet. They didn't have fields of barley or domesticated wheat. They were still hunter-gatherers, traveling the landscape, collecting wild grains by hand, and hunting wild animals for meat. They did not grow the barley, they had to forage for it over massive distances. And yet somehow, taking all that hard-earned, precious wild grain and turning it into beer was important enough that they figured out how to brew it before they figured out how to farm. Think about the implications of that. Because up until this discovery, the traditional textbook story of human civilization goes exactly like this. Humans realized that wandering around was dangerous and tiring. So they settled down, figured out how to plant seeds, invented agriculture, built permanent villages to protect their crops. And then, much later, with their surplus grain, someone accidentally left a bowl of porridge out in the rain. It fermented, and boom, alcohol was born. In this traditional view, alcohol is a byproduct of civilization. It came after we did the hard work of settling down. But the mortars in Raqefet Cave tell us the exact opposite. These people were brewing beer while they were still nomadic, and they are not the only ones. If we move forward just 1,000 years, around 12,000 years ago, someone in southeastern Turkey decided to build something truly unimaginable. At a site called Göbekli Tepe, massive limestone pillars, some standing over 16 feet tall and weighing up to 10 tons, were dragged up a hill and arranged in careful, deliberate circles. The stones were intricately carved with menacing images of scorpions, lions, boars, and vultures. The sheer scale of Göbekli Tepe is breathtaking. It is arguably the world's oldest temple, built thousands of years before Stonehenge or the Great Pyramids. And here is the kicker. It was built entirely by people who did not have metal tools, did not have the wheel, did not have pottery, and most importantly, did not have agriculture. They were still hunter-gatherers. For decades, archaeologists were scratching their heads, trying to explain how this was even possible. Why would nomadic people, who spent their entire lives just trying to survive day to day, suddenly organize the massive amount of labor required to carve and move 10-ton stones up a hill? You need hundreds of people working together for years. How do you feed them? How do you motivate them to do back-breaking labor instead of just hunting and gathering like they had done for thousands of years? Then, researchers found the answer hiding in plain sight. Scattered around the site of Göbekli Tepe were large limestone vats, some capable of holding up to 40 gallons of liquid. When the insides of these vats were tested, they found grayish-black residues containing calcium oxalate. In the brewing world, calcium oxalate is known as beer stone. It is the telltale chemical signature of fermented grain. People were brewing beer at Göbekli Tepe, and not just a little bit of beer for personal use. They were brewing on a massive industrial scale for a hunter-gatherer society. The current leading theory among anthropologists is that Göbekli Tepe was not a permanent city. There was no water source nearby for daily living. Instead, it was a massive regional gathering place for ritual, religion, and most importantly, feasting. Tribes traveled from hundreds of miles away across the region, came together at this hilltop, and drank massive amounts of beer. And this monumental discovery raises a question that has sparked one of the fiercest debates in modern archaeology. Why did humans really start farming? Dr. Patrick McGovern, an archaeobotanist and arguably the leading expert on ancient alcohol in the world, has spent decades arguing a theory that flips history on its head. He suggests that humans did not invent farming to make bread. They invented farming to make beer. And when you look at the evidence, it is incredibly compelling. Think about the process of making bread. You have to harvest the grain, thresh it, winnow it to remove the chaff, grind it into a fine flour using heavy stones, make a dough, knead it, wait for it to rise, build an oven, and bake it perfectly. It is a highly complex, labor-intensive process that doesn't offer an immediate, massive payoff. Beer, on the other hand, is much simpler. You take grain, you soak it in a vessel of water, you leave it out in the sun for a few days. Natural yeast from the air infects the mixture, and fermentation happens entirely by itself. It bubbles, it froths, and a few days later, you have a highly nutritious, mildly alcoholic porridge. The psychological and social desire to drink, to alter one's consciousness, to commune with the gods, and to bond with other humans around a fire would have been a far stronger motivator to go through the grueling work of planting seeds than simply the desire to eat grain in a slightly different solid form. If Dr. McGovern is right, and the evidence points heavily in his favor, then alcohol isn't just something that showed up after humans settled down. The thirst for beer might literally be the reason we settled down, invented agriculture, and started building civilization in the first place. As time marched on, human societies became more complex, and so did our drinks. By the time we reached 7000 BCE in a Neolithic village called Jiahu in the Henan province of central China, alcohol was no longer just fermented wild gruel. Archaeologists excavating the site found beautifully crafted pottery jars. When they ran chemical analysis on the porous clay inside, they found the residue of a highly complex, mixed fermented beverage. It was made from a fermented blend of rice, honey, wild grapes, and hawthorn berries. This wasn't an accident. This was a recipe. It is the oldest confirmed recipe for an alcoholic beverage anywhere in the world. What makes the Jiahu discovery so spectacular is that it proves early humans were master experimental chemists. They didn't have thermometers, hydrometers, or an understanding of microbiology. Yet they knew exactly how to combine the complex carbohydrates of rice with the simple sugars of honey and fruit to create a balanced, potent, and delicious drink. In fact, years later, the American craft brewery Dogfish Head actually partnered with Dr. McGovern to recreate this exact 9,000-year-old recipe, calling it Chateau Jiahu. The result was a sweet, fruity, surprisingly modern-tasting ale. Whoever was brewing this in ancient China knew exactly what they were doing, and they were doing it for community, for ritual, and for pleasure. From there, alcohol wove its way into the very fabric of human existence. Let's look at ancient Egypt. Around 5,000 years ago, in Egypt, beer wasn't just something people drank at a party on a Friday night. It was the absolute backbone of the empire's economy, diet, and religion. When you picture the construction of the Great Pyramids at Giza, you might imagine slaves being whipped under the scorching desert sun. But modern archaeology has proven that the pyramids were built by a respected, well-fed workforce of skilled laborers. And how were these laborers paid? In beer. The standard daily wage for a pyramid builder was about 4 to 5 liters of beer a day. That was their actual salary. Not gold, not silver coins, but thick, cloudy, nutrient-rich beer. And this made perfect logistical sense. The water from the Nile River was heavily relied upon, but in densely populated areas, it was often stagnant, contaminated with parasites, and completely unsafe to drink straight. But beer, because the grains had to be heated and boiled during the brewing process, and because the resulting alcohol and low pH killed off harmful bacteria, was clean. It was sanitary. It literally kept people alive in a way that raw water couldn't. If you were a laborer dragging multi-ton limestone blocks across the desert heat for 12 hours a day, you were burning an astronomical amount of calories. Ancient Egyptian beer was not filtered and fizzy like a modern lager. It was thick, almost like a gruel, packed with complex carbohydrates, B vitamins, and essential amino acids. Beer wasn't just a refreshing beverage, it was your lunch. It provided the pure, unadulterated energy needed to build the greatest monuments of the ancient world. Honestly, if you were working in the desert heat, burning thousands of calories, and someone offered you a choice between heavy metal coins you couldn't eat, or 5 liters of liquid bread that gave you energy and a pleasant buzz, you would take the beer every single time. But its importance in Egypt went far beyond just payroll. The Egyptians believed that beer was divine. It was created by Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and given to humanity as a supreme gift. They even had a goddess, Hathor, who was literally the deity of joy, music, and drunkenness. According to Egyptian mythology, a bloodthirsty goddess named Sekhmet was once sent down to destroy humanity. She was slaughtering humans by the thousands, and the gods realized they had to stop her. So, they brewed a massive lake of beer, dyed it red with pomegranate juice so it looked like blood, and tricked Sekhmet into drinking it. She drank so much that she passed out, waking up the next morning as a peaceful goddess, and humanity was saved. Beer literally saved the world in their eyes. Because of this, it was heavily featured in temple offerings, burial rituals to sustain the dead in the afterlife, and even medical prescriptions. Egyptian doctors would mix herbs, spices, and honey into beer, and prescribe it for everything from severe stomach problems and infections to gum disease. So in ancient Egypt, one single drink was functioning as a paycheck, a water purification system, a staple meal, a life-saving medicine, and a direct prayer to the gods, all poured from the same clay cup. As civilization spread out from the Middle East and Africa into Europe, the story of alcohol evolved, but its importance never faded. When the Greeks and later the Romans rose to power, they shifted the focus from the grain of beer to the grapes of wine. The Mediterranean climate was perfect for viticulture, and wine quickly became the ultimate symbol of culture, philosophy, and high society. The Greeks institutionalized drinking through the symposium, which translates directly to drinking together. These were highly structured banquets, where men would recline on couches, drink wine, and debate politics, philosophy, and poetry. But the Greeks were terrified of losing control. They believed that drinking unmixed, pure wine was something only wild, uncivilized barbarians would do. So they strictly mixed their wine with water, usually in a ratio of 3 parts water to 1 part wine. The goal was not to get blackout drunk. The goal was to maintain a steady, philosophical buzz that would allow for open conversation without descending into chaos. To the Greeks and Romans, if you drank wine, you were a civilized citizen. If you drank beer, you were an uncultured barbarian from the wild forests of the north. Yet those barbarians in the north were quietly perfecting the craft of brewing. As the Roman Empire fell and Europe entered the Middle Ages, the responsibility of preserving the knowledge of brewing fell into a very unlikely set of hands: Christian monks. Monasteries across Europe became the largest and most advanced breweries in the world. Monks took brewing incredibly seriously because, just like in ancient Egypt, beer was essential for survival. During the grueling periods of fasting, like Lent, monks were forbidden from eating solid food for 40 days, but the rules said nothing about liquids. So, German monks brewed an incredibly thick, dark, calorically dense style of beer called Doppelbock. which they affectionately referred to as liquid bread. It sustained them through the hardest, coldest months of the year. It was also during the Middle Ages that an anonymous, brilliant brewer realized that if you threw the green, cone-like flowers of the hop plant into boiling beer, it didn't just add a bitter balance to the sweet malt, it acted as a natural preservative. Before hops, beer would spoil in a matter of days. With the addition of hops, beer could survive for months. It could be stored, traded, and transported across borders. This single botanical discovery laid the groundwork for the globalized, multi-billion-dollar brewing industry we have today. And humanity's quest to refine alcohol didn't stop at fermentation. During the Islamic Golden Age in the 8th and 9th centuries, brilliant Arab alchemists and scholars were experimenting with early chemistry. They invented a device called the alembic still. Their goal wasn't to make stronger drinks. In fact, their religion forbade it. They were trying to purify substances for medicines and perfumes. By heating wine, they realized that ethanol boils at a lower temperature than water. The vapor would rise, cool, and condense into a highly potent liquid. They called the distilled essence of a substance alcohol, which is where we get the modern word alcohol. When this distillation technology eventually made its way back into Christian Europe, people realized that if you drank this distilled liquid, it burned your throat, warmed your chest, and affected your brain faster than any beer or wine ever could. They viewed it as literal magic, calling it aqua vitae, the water of life. This led to the creation of whiskey in Scotland and Ireland, vodka in Eastern Europe, and brandy in France. These high-proof spirits wouldn't spoil on long ocean voyages, making them the fuel for the age of exploration. Heavily traded on ships, navigating the newly mapped oceans of the globe. So, when we look at the grand tapestry of human history, a stunningly clear picture emerges. 10 million years ago, your primate ancestors were drawn to the scent of fermented fruit on the forest floor, because the calories hidden inside helped them survive. 13,000 years ago, nomadic humans were deliberately crushing grains and brewing beer in dark caves, long before they even knew how to plant a wheat field. 12,000 years ago, they were possibly organizing the labor to build the first monumental structures in human history, specifically to have a sacred place to gather and drink together. 9,000 years ago, they were engineering complex, multi-ingredient recipes. 5,000 years ago, entire empires and their economies were running on liquid bread. And for the thousands of years since, alcohol has driven trade, inspired philosophy, shaped religions, and built economies. The traditional narrative is that alcohol was merely a byproduct of the world we built, that it came after we settled down, after we became civilized. But the archaeological, biological, and historical evidence tells a much more profound story. There is a very real, scientifically backed possibility that alcohol is not the byproduct of civilization. It is the architect of it. It is the reason we settled down. It is the social lubricant that allowed tribes of humans to trust each other, to bond, and to collaborate on massive projects. Every single time you raise a glass, whether it's a craft IPA, a vintage wine, or a simple cocktail, you are not just having a drink. You are participating in an unbroken, continuous ritual that predates your species having a name for itself. The technology has changed, the distillation processes have improved, the glassware has certainly gotten fancier, but the fundamental human impulse remains exactly the same. It is the exact same impulse that made a small primate reach for a piece of overripe fruit on a damp forest floor 10 million years ago. We didn't invent the desire for it. We just spent the last 10,000 years learning how to make it on purpose. If this journey through the drunken history of humanity surprised you, if it changed the way you look at your weekend drink, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden history of everyday things. All the research, the studies from Dr. Dudley, and the archaeological papers on Göbekli Tepe are linked down in the description if you want to dig deeper. Let me know in the comments below. Do you think we built farming for bread, or did we build it for beer? Cheers, and I will see you in the next video.